Welcome to Stand Alone, where we only meet with the best of the best. And I can't think of anyone that is more impressive to talk about. How do we go from being ordinary to extraordinary? Steven Kolter is the man. So when you think about writing books, everyone knows that, like, when we hear what is the most difficult thing to do, it would probably be writing a book. Imagine writing 10 best-selling books. You are the world leading expert on human performance, but we're not just talking about any books. We're talking about books that billionaires read. This is impressive. So, Steven, I wanted to open up by asking you this question because this book, The Art of Impossible, is, you labeled it so well, calling it a primer. And when I think of a primer, it's like, it's the thing that we put on the wall before we put the paint on so it sticks. And so that's important because this is the primer for high performance, but we still have to do the work. And you've done an enormous amount of work on yourself. And you talk about this time in your life when you are riding the waves, when you're coming out of a disease that's debilitating, but then you're riding the waves and you say these words, I was disassembled. And I wanted to, market this in terms of that theme of us going from ordinary to extraordinary, us disassembling what it takes so we can build our best version of ourselves. And I want to kick off this question of, everyone wants to be a high performance person. We're so engulfed with motivation, but you say that motivation is just the primer. Then we have to go to learning. Then we have to go into creativity. And I wanted you to really start off with the 5 stacks, because I think this is, where we unravel what it really takes to be a high performer. And if you could kick us off where you just really drive home to everyone that motivation isn't enough. It's not going to get you to be a high performer. A lot of us are excited. We want more, but that's just the start. And how does curiosity blend this in? I thank you for being with us. And if you could kick us off with this, we're so ready to learn from you. We know you're a valuable person with very important connections in your world. So we appreciate you being, and we don't want to waste a minute hearing me. We want to hear from you. Let's go.
So let's roll back one step.
Yes.
We're going to talk about peak human performance. So what the hell do I mean by peak performance? Let's just start there. Yes. When I talk about peak performance, I am talking about nothing more or less, I guess, than getting our biology to work for us rather than against us. That's it. Everybody who's human is hardwired for peak performance. We come with certain capabilities built in, including the ability to elevate our performance significantly. When we talk about our biology, right? What the hell do we mean by our biology? There are really Art of Impossible focuses predominantly on cognitive peak performance. So I'm not going to talk about athletics and things like that. We can if you want to go there, but Art of Impossible focuses on cognitive peak performance. On the cognitive level, there, as you pointed out, there's 4 key skill sets. Starts with motivation, learning, creativity, and then flow. And just quickly, flow, for those who are not familiar with the term, it is technically, scientifically defined as an optimal state of consciousness where we feel our best and we perform our best. More specifically, it refers to any of those sort of in the zone moments when you get so focused on the task at hand that everything else just seems to disappear. You get so intensely focused that you sort of merge with what you're doing, your sense of self-consciousness, that diminishes greatly. Time will pass strangely. It'll slow down. You get a freeze frame. In fact, maybe you've been in a car crash. Much more frequently, it speeds up and you get so sucked into what you're doing that like 4 hours go by in what feels like 4 minutes. And throughout, all aspects of performance, both mental and physical, go through the roof. So that's flow. These 4 categories, the way I like to just sort of think about it generally, and as I said, they're not, motivation isn't a single thing. That's a heading, right? And there are, when psychologists use the term motivation or neuroscientists use the term motivation, there's actually 4 sets of skills underneath that heading. Same thing with learning, creativity, and flow. Bunch of skills under each of those headings. But the way I think about it is motivation gets you into the game. Learning allows you to continue to play. Creativity is how you steer. And this is especially important. You know, The Art of Impossible is a book about people going after really high, hard goals, stretching yourself. And often when you're going after high, hard goals, you don't quite know how to get there, right? So creativity is how you steer. And then finally, flow, this optimal state of consciousness, so all of us, is how you turbo boost the results into the stratosphere. So that's sort of the 4-pack that you're talking about. And it's basically the 4 components of our biology. Those are the 4 kind of characteristics evolution gave us to perform at our best.
I love this. And, you know, it's so important that people get this book, because you talk about, you know, when you were younger and you were a magician. And I love how you started off saying this, because whenever we do something new, the people that are really good, what we would deem an expert, they look like a magician to us, right? They look like, wow, how are you doing that? It seems so, you know, effortless. And you really say this so well, where you pull back the curtain on what was behind the magic, and then you applied that to peak performance. Because when we think of someone who is in peak performance, we think of a magician, right? And you're peeling back these layers. So I really wanted to ask you, how did someone from, you know, Ohio doing magic start to even write books that billionaires are reading, that are so influential around the world, right? And I have a very large global audience, and this is inspiring for a lot of people. But if they know a little bit about you, that helps for people to relate to you, so that they can see it just doesn't happen, right? You say some really great things, like learn to be your best when you're at the worst. And you made a reference to a great author in your book. And, you know, just talking about that for the audience, where you went through these like pivotal moments in your life where you're constantly working on becoming your best so that you could get to where you are right now. And I know you're still working at it, because like you say in the book, it's an infinite game. It doesn't stop, right? So if you could touch on that for the audience, about what does it mean to learn to be your best when you're at your worst?
So I said a second ago, motivation is this skills. It's this catch-all term, right? When psychologists talk about motivation, they're talking about 4 different categories of skills. There's what's known as extrinsic motivation. That's stuff in the world that you'll work hard to get: money, fame, etc. There's intrinsic motivation. And earlier you mentioned curiosity. Curiosity is a big intrinsic motivation. So it was passion, purpose. There's a couple others. Then you have a bunch of goal setting skills. There's 3 tiers of goal setting that work that biological organisms need. And then we get to where you are, which is grit. And grit is essentially what you need when the motivation runs out. And if you spend time in the world of peak performance, there are about 6 different categories of grit that peak performers tend to train. Excuse me. I tend to lose my voice, apparently. The peak performers tend to train. And one of them is the grit to be your best when you're at your worst. And what's interesting about these grit skills is, especially in the beginning, you have to, everything in the book is laid out in a particular sequence, and the sequence isn't arbitrary. I'm following our biology. Our biology was shaped to get turned on certain points in our life through development. And so certain things work better in certain orders. It's not, you can jump around, you can do whatever you want, but yeah, I just say, if you do it in the order that you were designed to do it in, you just go farther, faster with a lot less fuss. So the first, there are a bunch of early on grit skills, but after you started to build up grit a little bit, training to be your best when you're at your worst. And this is really key for a lot of reasons. First of all, usually when we're at our worst, there's a lot of fear in the system. Fear knocks performance down almost an entire level. So the way they talk about it, let's talk about motor skills, like playing the piano or something like that. This is the easiest way to explain it. We talk about 3 levels of learning when you're learning a motor skill, or really anything. There's a conscious level where you're just like, okay, I'm learning to play this. I'm watching my fingers on the keyboards of the piano. Then there's associative. It's you start to play a little bit of on your own without having to think about, but you're still thinking about a little, and then finally get to automatic, where you're just playing automatically. Fear will knock you down a level. automatically. So if you're really gripped, doesn't matter if you've managed to, practice Beethoven's concerto 50 times. If enough fear comes into the equation, it's going to kick you down a level. And if you haven't practiced being great when you're like that, you're going to be screwed. The example I give in the book, I give a lot of speeches, and it's funny because I've been on stage, as you pointed out, since I was 11 years old. I started doing magic when I was 11, and that bled into X, Y, and Z. And I've really been on stage almost for 40 years at this point. I'm an introvert, and I'm terrified of being on stage. I don't like it at all. I'm really good at it, but I'm really good at it because I've practiced for 40 years. This is how crazy I am when I write a new speech. And then I'll tell you a story about like how it worked for me. So when I write a new speech, I'll write my speech, I'll build a slide deck, whatever. I'll practice it a handful of times, just my office alone. I'll usually do it for somebody, a friend, maybe my editor, maybe somebody I work with, sometimes my wife. And then I will pick a day where it's a day where I didn't get enough sleep the night before. I worked, I work ridiculous hours anyways. I work 10 hours, 12 hours, 14 hours. And then I'll go to the gym and I'll work out, and I'll work out really hard, and I'll come home, and before I have time to eat, so I'm hungry, I'm exhausted, I'm all those things, I'll grab my dogs. I live in the mountains, and I will hike the mountain behind my house and do my speech. And if I can do my speech while hiking a mountain after not sleeping very well, working a full day and being exhausted, I can sort of do my speech anywhere. And I've been, so funny story. Years ago, I was lucky enough to get to open for President Obama at a huge business conference in Europe. And there's like 25,000 people in the audience, and there's another 50,000 people being beamed in live. And I'm backstage, I'm about to go on. The presenter, the guy who organized the whole event, is super nervous, and he's standing by the curtain. He's just like so scared. And I was like, dude, calm down. I got this. I got the memo. I talked to your people. My speech is 27 minutes and 30 seconds, exactly as you asked. The timing was really precise. And the dude is already pale as a sheet, and just like everything drains out of his face. And he looks at me. He's like, oh my God, they didn't tell you. It needs to be 22 minutes and 15 seconds. And by the way, you're on in 5, 4, 3, 2. And they're like, threw me on stage, right? So I'm opening for Obama. It's one of the largest audiences I've ever, it's a stadium. And if you've never walked into a stadium before, it's a thing. If you're not, and I'm not used to doing, I'm used to doing big rooms, but not like that. And this is what you train for, right? You train for like that moment. And I nailed it. I cut 5 minutes out of the speech in real time. It was a really hard speech to cut. That was the other part of it. It was all the speeches I give. It was you pointed out that my information is pretty information dense. They wanted me to talk about one of my books, Bold. That is the most complicated of my books to talk about, because there's just a lot of big ideas before you even can understand what the hell I'm talking about. And so that was the speech I had to cut stuff out of before I opened for, or while I was opening for Obama. That's what you train for, right? Because that's not like how much. Maybe it's commonplace for other people to get to open for the president. It's not commonplace in my life. You know what I mean? So that is not something you want to fuck up. That's something you want to absolutely nail. And if I wouldn't have trained for how to be able to keep calm and think while exhausted, while really scared, I would have screwed that up badly. That's just, one random example. But I'm a big believer in training to be your best when you're at your worst.
Yeah, and you've consistently done this. And I really wanted to dig into people understanding how to learn. And you talk about this so beautifully in the book, where you really go into knowledge acquisition versus skill acquisition. And then you go into it at another layer deeper, where you talk about specialized knowledge versus general knowledge. And, in our lives, I wanted to talk about general knowledge, because if you look at very successful people, their careers kind of zigzag, and you talk about this, why, especially for the audience today, like a lot of us think like, well, it's too late. I didn't spend my whole life. Like, I'm not Tiger Woods. My father didn't come to me when I was 4 and put the golf clubs. Right. So right. If you could address that with the audience.
I'm glad you brought that up. It's a really good point. And I like to give credit where credit was due. So this is the stuff I'm about to talk about. This is not my work. This is my friend David Epstein's work. He wrote a brilliant book about it called Range. And most of the work in Art of Impossible is my own, but I thought this was so important I had to include it. David studied early specialization. He was looking at early specialization, Tiger Woods, right? And it turns out it's really rare. It's not, even though we heard about the 10,000 hours and blah, blah, and all the hype, turns out that's actually an incredibly rare path. Most people bounce around from thing to thing to thing. They sample this and they sample this. It's economists have a really good term for it that I'm gonna forget. It's something matching. I just blanked it. But you're basically looking for a match between, you know, who you are, passion and purpose and curiosity, and those things. Match fit is what economists call it. Thank you. Pardon me. And when you get that, it tends to be, you know, you tend to explode. So then you're like, oh my God, this is it. But it's, you know, I've been writing since I was 4 or 5 years old. And by the time I was like 12, 13, 14, maybe 15, I knew this is what I sort of wanted to do. Though, you know, that's only, I'm a writer. I also am an entrepreneur. I have, you know, I run animal sanctuaries. There's about 11 different things I sort of do at once. And my generalist background, first of all, I was a journalist also for a long time, and it was really helpful there. But I tend to think that like real generalism, like a really solid knowledge base in a lot of things, one serves you very, very well as a person, as an expert growing on, because as you noticed, very rarely, especially these days, we don't have one career anymore, right? There was a stat about millennials, and I don't like Gen Z, I don't even know what the stat is there, but millennials, the average millennial will change jobs like 6 times before they're 30 or 35, right? That's an incredible stat. And I spent a long time, and I talk about this a little bit in Art of Impossible. My interest is in what I call long haul creativity. People have been creative and reinvented themselves again and again and again and again and again. And I'm really fascinated by that, because in creative careers, I came up as a magazine journalist. I learned a style of magazine writing known as new journalism. Doesn't mean anything to anybody anymore. Like I say that, and people are like, what? You're what, huh? I was best in the world at a thing. I spent 20 years becoming best in the world at like long form magazine journalism. I'm best in the world. I was one of 1,000 people who were really good at this craft. And then starting with the sort of the dot-com crash in 2001 and the housing recession by 2007, long form narrative journalism as an art form disappeared from the face of the earth. So like the thing I spent 20 years becoming best in the world at, or trying to become best in the world at, was gone, just gone. Which, by the way, is a very difficult thing to have to deal with. But I think it's really, like, it's very common these days. We're going to have to get very flexible, good at job retraining, right? Good at continuously learning in today's world is absolutely critical, because this is going to keep happening as sort of the world's changed. I mean, think about like somebody whose career started out in social media and they're an expert in Facebook, and they spent a decade becoming an expert, or before Facebook, they did it in Friendster or MySpace, which don't even exist anymore, right? Like, and Facebook is basically archaic at this point also, right? Yeah. So like, you know, even if you have a job where you think, okay, marketing, you know, something is stable and more normal than being an author or whatever, what the hell are you going to do? Because, you know, the internet reinvents the platform you're going to be marketing on every year or two. And, you know, for all those people who've just spent the past 5 years figuring out how to like rock on Clubhouse and TikTok,
right?
2 years from now, those things are going to go away, right? And like, so you're going to have to, you're either going to reinvent yourself, or you're not, you know, you're going to be out of work, kind of thing. And so those were questions I was interested in poking. And I don't know if I just answered your question, or just took us on a tangent, but I'll stop there.
I think it's so important for people, because this is what people need to hear. You know, one of the big things that you addressed also too was, you know, the old way of learning, where it was the 3 R's, and then you talk about the 4 C's, right? You talk about creativity, critical thinking, collaboration, and cooperation. And most people, when they think about high performance people, they don't think about necessarily creativity. They think they're so specialized, but actually, how your book, really drills into it, like emotional intelligence is needed, working with other people is needed, and you talk about this. I would like for you to spend just a little bit to encourage people about being creative, like in terms.
So one thing let's just stop, and you gotta think about what expertise actually means.
Mhm.
Expertise it means that if you're inside your area, any direction you go, you have 360-degree creativity. You're not just the best at this, you're creative in it, right? And there isn't a job in the world right now that doesn't really, okay, maybe there are still a handful of manual labor jobs left that don't involve creativity. But most, well-run, I'll give you an example from Toyota. They have a management philosophy called Kaizen, which says, even if you work on the line, and you're putting hubcaps on wheels, which sounds like the most rote mechanical job in the world, they want you to make Toyota as a whole a better company. And they do this because it gives employees autonomy, it raises the challenge level, it drives engagement. It really works for Toyota, but it takes a job that you would think is automatic and say, no. You may think you're working on the assembly line, you actually have a creative job where you have to make the entire hubcap application process better. That seems to be most jobs these days. And that's definitely the way to advance. And certainly, when they look at so-called 21st century skills, the skills we need to thrive in the 21st century, and this is everything from what's the skill that's most important in a CEO to what's the skill that's most important for us to teach our children, right? Creativity tops pretty much every list of 20 most important 21st century skills. So I think it's foundational, and I don't think you don't get to be an expert without creativity. And it doesn't matter where you are. You can go into the driest, most academic field you could possibly think of. You get to the very top, you're going to find creatives.
Yeah. And, and correct me if I'm saying this name incorrectly, Csikszentmihalyi.
You did it right. Nice.
Okay, awesome. So, he talked about this, and I love this. When I was reading his 10 characteristics of both and, I was literally like,
that's so cool, hope, right? Yeah.
For me.
Yeah, that's why that's in there, because I had the same. Everybody has that reaction where you're like, oh, thank God.
I know.
Thank God.
I thought I had to check myself in sometimes.
No, I know.
Could you talk about that, where a lot of us feel like, and there was one that you talked about, ambitious and selfless. This is a lot of people can't navigate between.
So Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, the late Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who passed away in October, he's the godfather of flow psychology, but he was one of the world's leading experts on creativity. And he made an interesting observation. And Mike and I have a slight disagreement about this, and I'll get there in a second. He noticed that most people are binary. Their personalities are either or, they're this or that, but creatives are both and. And as you pointed out, there's a long list of creatives are extremely introverted and also extremely extroverted. They're very, very selfish, as you pointed out, and they're also very, very selfless. They're very, very smart and sharp, but they're also very, very naive. They can be very rebellious and conservative. So let me give you an example. So rebellious and conservative. I'll give you an example. So I've got a new novel coming out in April, and it's a sci-fi thriller, but it's a little noirish. It's a cyberpunk thriller. And noir is a style of writing that emerged in the 50s, right? In sort of detective fiction. And in my writing, I'm pushing it. I'm like importing this kind of style of writing into a cutting edge sci-fi novel. So I'm being rebellious, but I'm also conserving the tradition of noir writing, right? There's a tradition here and I'm conserving it. So I'm being very conservative, but I'm also being rebellious. It's both and. And I think for creatives, if you grow up this way, they don't tell you this, right? They don't tell you you're both and you feel very bipolar, very schizophrenic. The thing that is really important here, and this is where Mihai Csikszentmihalyi and myself had a disagreement. He thought that these were creative traits. You were born this way, and I think that's true. But I think the actual, from a neurobiological, a lot of the work I do is based on neuroscience. And if you look at the neuroscience of creativity and what happens to the brain as you become more creative and you train yourself up in creativity, you actually start becoming more both and one of the things this ends up doing is you end up with a whole bunch more emotions than you've ever had before in your life, right? And this is really, I mean, especially the people who come to creativity later in their life, suddenly to be like, you know, in your 30s and your 40s and your 50s, and suddenly there's a whole shitload of emotions that you've never dealt with before, and you're suddenly feeling them. It can be really disorienting, especially when like deep empathy starts to come on. That's a really, like, you end up feeling for the world, and if you're not used to that, you know, that can be a sort of a rough experience, I think. So I tell people, like, if you're going to do this work, you're going to, and you know, there's a section on training creativity. If you're going to train creativity up in your life, it's great. It's going to translate into so much success for you in the end, but be prepared for what's coming, right? There's an emotional cost that's going to come with that.
Yeah, I can't stress how important it is for people to really dive into this, because as the world is changing, like, you are going to have to like move with it and then still be creative to possibly create the change instead of reacting all the time. You know, in my line of work, I say to the people, I'm respectfully pushing the boundaries all the time. And it sometimes reads as disrespect for the traditions, but I always have that in my mind. So thank you for not making me feel like I have to check myself in, and that this is
You're welcome. Yeah, I'm glad I was of
this is
service.
okay. This is
Yeah, totally.
okay. I
I'm
really,
glad I was useful.
yes. You know, talking about neurobiology, because, you know, I studied my whole life to want to be a doctor, and then I got thrown into the business world by survival, you know. And so I had to learn a whole different world. And, you know, what helped me was that I love science. And so I applied business, and I did what you talked about. I overlapped it, like my science knowledge with business, and it helped me to perform better. And, you know, you talk about the prefrontal cortex, and you talk about the transient hypofrontality,
Hypofrontality.
right? You know, if you could talk about this, because I think this is very profound. A lot of us think one thing, but it's actually the complete opposite going on in our biology. So when people are in this high peak performance state, I think I would love for you to explain this to people, because this should get you intrigued to get the book, to read more about it, because when you can understand biology and you can understand science, it actually relaxes you and you allow your body to perform because you have a better understanding of it. Instead of people thinking it's a mystery and you know, there's a lot of unknown, we'll get to know the unknown as much as you can. So what is that, and how does that relate to performing at a higher level?
So what you're talking about is when we drop into a state of flow, when we're in the zone, there are profound neurobiological changes in the brain. And the old idea of peak performance, which most people are familiar with, is actually what's known as the 10% brain myth. It's this idea that I'm only using a small chunk of my brain, say 10%. So peak performance, it must be the full brain on overdrive, right? And it turns out that's actually not the case. When we're performing at our best, when we're in flow, when we're in the zone, we're not using more of the brain, we're using less of the brain. Now, transient hypofrontality was the original word for it. We now talk about it more as localized frontality, but I'll come to that in a second. What this basically means is when we move into flow, our transient hypofrontality, transient means temporary, hypo is the opposite of hyper. It means to deactivate, to shut down, to slow down. And frontality, as you pointed out, is the prefrontal cortex. So as we drop into flow, the prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that's right behind our forehead, gets really, really quiet. We used to think it worked across the board. That was transient hypofrontality. Now we know there's broad deactivation, but exactly which parts deactivate, it depends on what you're doing. But the point here is, so some of flow's more mysterious qualities. For example, I talked earlier about the fancy word is time dilation. It's time passing strangely. Time slows down or it speeds up, right? Why does that happen? What the hell's going on? Why would time disappear? So time is actually a calculation. It's normally performed by large portions of the prefrontal cortex. Now, your prefrontal cortex, this is like higher cognitive functions, your so-called executive functions, long-term planning, logical decision-making, your sense of morality, your sense of willpower. That's all prefrontal cortex. In flow, this portion of the brain deactivates, it turns off. And one of the things that disappears is our ability to calculate time. So when the prefrontal cortex shuts down, we lose the ability to separate past from present from future. We're plunged into what researchers talk about as the deep now, or the elongated present. Poets talk about the eternal present. It's right, the now that stretches out when you get so sucked into what you're doing that 5 hours go by in like 5 minutes. That's what we're talking about. But this is a big impact on performance. So here's what's cool. Most of your fears, so we know anxiety is terrible for performance. It's terrible for the reasons we talked about at the start of the podcast. It blocks learning. It does a whole bunch of other things. Anxiety, bad for performance. So most of our anxieties are either scary stuff that happened in the past that we're trying to avoid from here in the present, or it's scary shit that might happen in the future that we're trying to avoid from here in the present. But if I remove past and future, anxiety levels literally plummet. Our stress hormones get flushed out of our system. So we experience this sort of as liberation, as freedom, as joy. It's one of the things that happens in flow. Same thing that happens to our sense of self. I talked about earlier as we drop into flow, that self-consciousness, that inner critic, that voice in your head that's always that nagging defeatist voice that's always on. So that lives essentially in the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex, which is a really fancy way of saying the outside of your brain, right here. And that's essentially where your inner critic lives, more on the right than on the left side. When that shuts down, the voice in our head goes silent. So once again, we see this as liberation, as freedom. Risk-taking goes through the roof. Creativity goes through the roof. Why? Because you're no longer doubting every idea you have, right? The voice in your head isn't knocking it down as soon as it pops in your head. So this isn't all of what happens in flow. There's more stuff going on in the brain and the body during this state. But this helps explain some of the more like quasi mystical things that happen in flow that really give the experience, an altered state of consciousness. This happens. Now, by the way, these same experiences, so meditation can do the same thing, right? When our sense of self gets really quiet, if you've done breath work or meditation of any kind, same process. Slightly different things are going on in flow than in meditation, but it's that localized frontality. It's parts of the prefrontal cortex shutting down.
Yes, I love this. And this, when I read this in your book, I was like, well, this is what everyone thinks stand alone is all about, being alone. And I always tell people it's not about necessarily being alone, but you have to be alone, right? And in your book, you talk about no time and no one, right? Yeah. And
non-time and no one.
Yes. And if you could, as we get everything wrapped up and packaged for everyone, like, why is it so important, especially today where there's so much noise in the world and it's a lot of like surface information? I always, tell my team the most dangerous people sometimes are people that think they know everything, because the people, you said it too, like specialists, we kind of feel, or people that are specialized, they feel dumb sometimes. Like we don't know enough. We're always on a hunt to learn more. But how in today's world, and why is it so important to spend that alone time, the no time, so that you can, if you can explain to people why you have to carve that out so that you can feed this, flow state and high performance person that's crying to come out of you.
So, a lot of this it's a creativity thing. So you're part of your brain, the anterior cingulate cortex, and it does a lot of really wonderful things. One of the things it does is it helps us find solutions to problems. And when there's a lot of fear and anxiety in the system, it chooses logical solutions. because when there's a lot of anxiety, your brain goes, I don't want to experiment. Give me something that works every time. What's tried, what's true, what's you know what I mean? I don't want to fuck around. What's going to work? The more relaxed you are, the calmer you are, the farther the anterior cingulate cortex will look for remote associations between ideas. So creativity, right, outside the box thinking is what happens when you're really connecting far away ideas. So you need, if you're trying to amplify creativity, you need that. So what are common causes of anxiety? One of the most common is time stress. We are all massively time stressed. I like to get up and I like to write my books. I get up really early. I start working usually at 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the morning. Now that's just, I like to get up that early. This isn't discipline. I will naturally wake up then. So I'm just sort of working in conjunction with my biology normally. But one of the reasons I love those early morning hours is the phone doesn't ring. Nobody's awake. My dogs are asleep. You know, every email is closed off. All social media, everything's turned off. The time belongs to no one. And why does it matter? You asked earlier, what does it take to write 10 bestsellers, right? One of the answers is patience. I have to be willing to say, you know, if it takes me 2 hours to write this damn paragraph, I will spend 2 hours writing this damn paragraph because it's going to be perfect. Because that's what it takes to write bestsellers, right? Like, and if I was time stressed, if I had to spend 9 a.m. to 11 a.m., those 2 hours, right, writing a paragraph, I'd be furious. I'd be so stressed out by it, right? But because it's 4 a.m. to 6 a.m., well, it's non-time. It doesn't belong to anybody. It doesn't even feel like it belongs to me so much. It just belongs to the work. And so, especially if you're doing anything usually creative, non-time and no one, we like collaborate. Everything is very collaborative, but like we don't, if you really want to do hard thinking, you got to do it by yourself, right? You have to do it by yourself, and you need kind of non-time and no one. You need to buy yourself space to think in those ways, I think.
Yeah,
I do the same thing. I do this thing on learning. Like when I want to learn a subject, I'll book myself into a hotel room someplace where there's a balcony with a view. And I will go someplace where I know no one and there's a view that's pretty. And I will sit on that balcony and read 8 books on neuroscience over like 3 days and not leave. I will pull myself out of the world to go, you know, sit down and, okay, let's figure out this, you know, how does this thing work? And that's how I have to do it.
And you mentioned this, the long creativity, when people take long distance walks in nature, you know, it taps into that. So you can continuously be creative. You know, just to wrap everything up, I think that, you know, for a lot of people today, we want like a hack. We want like, tell me what I have to do. Like, Mr. Kotler, if you just tell me like 2 things that I could do right now. And I love the way you say this, like, and I want you to say it, right?
Well, I don't know what I don't know what I said in the book. Usually so usually when pretty much every time I give a speech, somebody raises their hand and does that. And my answer is always the same. Fuck off. Like, go away. There is absolutely nothing. There are no 3 things I can teach you, because the truth of the matter is, what's cool about peak performance is like you go through the art of impossible. There's a bunch of onboarding practices. There's a bunch of stuff you have to do to get going. But if you get to the end of the book, there's really peak performance. And what we mean by peak performance, it's about 6 things to do every day. By the way, that obscene sound in the background is my dog drinking water, and I can't go get him.
Dogs are angels on earth. So
I agree with that. It's really about 6 things that you should be doing every day and about 7 different things you should be doing every week. So it's not it's a checklist. And I mean, the peak performance is really within anybody's reach. I always say that, like, one of the things that has been really interesting for my life is I've spent my entire life basically meeting intentionally the most extraordinary people ever, right? Like my career for 30 years was covering those moments in time in any field when the impossible became possible. So the people responsible for that are some ass kickers, and they're extraordinary human beings. But I always tell people, all the people that I've met and have interviewed and whatever, they're all extraordinary, but none of them started out that way. They just started out like you and me. Extraordinary is like the proper application of these 6 things every day, 7 things every week. And it's why you can't tell you there are 3 things I can tell you to do Monday morning, but the problem is it's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, repeat, repeat, repeat. And the thing about peak performance, and this is why, like, if you're asking me that, what are the 3 things to do Monday morning? You're not serious about peak performance. And the reason I know you're not serious about peak performance is peak performance works like compound interest. You know this, right? You do these little tiny things every day and nothing changes for months and months and months. But then like you're 6 months in and suddenly you're like, oh my God, how the hell did I get so far? So right. And suddenly you get it and you're like, oh, wow, now, and it keeps going from there, right? Because once you start exponential growth, once you start getting the compound interest, it just keeps compounding, which is why I think also when you look at peak performers, not only does their expertise, that what they can do look like a magic trick, but how far ahead of you or right they are. That's another, and you're like, I don't. And I can't explain that to you other than to say peak performance works like compound interest. And you will start to find, as you set out on this path, that you end up like you taking these huge steps, but you have to take so many tiny steps in a row before you get to take the big steps. My buddy Andrew Huberman, who's at Stanford,
he's amazing.
Yeah. Andrew likes to say, and I totally agree with him. And we're not sure maybe it came from the Navy, because we're not sure where this came from originally, but he's so right. He says, look, the biggest difference between peak performers and everybody else is that peak performers know that it's always crawl, walk, run. Yeah. Right. And what happens with most people is they're like, yo, dude, I don't crawl. That's not me. I don't crawl. Right. I don't even walk. I'm a running man. Right?
Oh man.
That, right. And you get that. And peak performers, they don't like, what happens is, of course, you have to start, everybody starts where you crawl. So these people who want to start by running or whatever, they spend months looking for shortcuts or how do I learn this or what's the hack or whatever. And peak performers are just like, I'm going to suck. Because the experience of learning it's the same for all of us. It's I suck. Oh, look, I don't suck so much today, right? Like that's learning for all of us. On the inside, it feels terrible for everybody, right? There's nobody who's like, oh, I suck. This is great. I suck. This is great. Like, no, it's I suck. Oh, look, I don't suck. Crawl, walk, run. And the difference is I know I'm going to suck. So I just I start sucking now. Let's just start. Let's get the sucking over with. Let's start it now and just keep going. I don't care. I've sucked at so many things that I get to be great at so many things at this point, right? That's like, you don't get to be great at a bunch of stuff if you don't suck at a bunch of stuff in the beginning. That's just what it is. It's crawl, walk, run. And if you don't waste your time looking for shortcuts and you're just like, okay, I'm just going to start at the beginning. A, B, C, right? You get there.
This is beautiful. That is so beautiful to end with that. I just highly recommend this. You say in the book, no one starts out extraordinary. The podcast is called Ordinary to Extraordinary. This is the primer so that when you do the work that it will take, it will actually stick to you. And as you say so beautifully, you get your biology to work for you instead of against you, which a lot of people, really are suffering because they think it's some mystery. But I think your book so beautifully pulls the curtain back and says, actually, no, this is exactly what's happening on a chemical, electrical, anatomical basis. So thank you for your work. I just want to say, it's really impressive when someone dedicates their life to hunting something down. And I think that's what you've done. You've hunted out greatness. Mm-hmm. And you've written a lot of great, books about it, but even your work that you do with the Flow Research Collective, I partaken in that. It's amazing. I've met some really remarkable people. So I just want to say I commend you for all of your work, and thank you for being a dedicated human being on planet Earth. I really, really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you for your interest. It's very sweet of you to say.
Thank you.
Fun being with you.